Light feels permanent. It surrounds you constantly, defining everything you see. It fills space, reflects off surfaces, travels across vast distances, and arrives exactly where it's needed. It feels continuous, almost indestructible, like something that simply exists without interruption. But that feeling hides something strange, because light disappears all the time. Every time light hits a surface, your wall, your desk, your skin, it stops. The beam that was traveling through space suddenly ends. It doesn't pass through unchanged. It doesn't continue forward in the same form. It is absorbed. And once that happens, you never see that light again. So what actually happened to it? It's easy to say that the light was absorbed, but that word doesn't really explain anything. It just replaces one mystery with another. Because if light is something real, something that carries energy, something that moves through space, then absorption sounds a lot like destruction. The light was there, and now it isn't. So does light get destroyed? Or does it go somewhere else? This question seems simple, but it leads directly into one of the most fundamental principles in physics. A principle so deeply embedded in how the universe works that, if it were ever broken, reality itself would stop making sense. Because according to everything we understand, energy cannot be destroyed, and light is energy. So if light disappears, but energy cannot be destroyed, then something else must be happening. Something you don't see. Something that takes place at the exact moment. Light vanishes. Right now, light is hitting objects all around you. Photons are arriving, interacting, and disappearing from view. But none of that energy is being lost. It is being transformed, redirected, redistributed into forms that no longer look like light. Which means that when light disappears, it may not be dying at all. It may be changing into something else entirely. And if that's true, then the moment light seems to end is not the end of anything. It's the beginning of something you've never been taught to see. There is a very specific moment you experience constantly, yet almost never think about. A moment so ordinary that it blends into the background of everything you see. Light travels through space, reaches a surface, and then it stops. Not gradually, not with a visible transition. It simply ends. The beam that existed a fraction of a second ago is no longer there. It doesn't bounce away in the same form. It doesn't continue forward. It disappears from your view entirely, and your mind accepts that without question, because you immediately replace it with something else. The color of the surface, the brightness of the object, the image that forms in your eyes. But that replacement hides the actual process, because when light stops, something extremely precise is happening. A photon, carrying a specific amount of energy, arrives at an atom. Not a surface in general, not an object as a whole, but an individual atom or electron within that material. And in that instant, the photon is absorbed, not stored as a tiny particle sitting somewhere inside, not trapped in the way an object would be, but transferred. Its energy is taken up by the system it interacts with, and the photon itself ceases to exist as a photon. And this is where things become uncomfortable, because if the photon no longer exists in that form, it feels like something has been destroyed. The thing that was traveling through space is gone. There is no smaller version left behind, no fragment, no hidden piece continuing its journey. The photon, as a particle of light, is no longer there. And if you stop the explanation at that point, it sounds exactly like destruction. But that's only because you're focusing on the form, not the energy. The photon is not just a thing. It is a packet of energy, a specific interaction waiting to happen. And when that interaction occurs, the energy doesn't vanish. It changes form. It becomes something else, something that no longer behaves like light, and therefore no longer appears as light in your perception. The energy can excite an electron, pushing it into a higher state. It can increase the motion of atoms, becoming heat. It can trigger chemical changes, electrical currents, even biological processes inside your own body. The same energy that was once traveling as light is now part of something else entirely, integrated into the system it interacted with. And this is the key shift, because from your perspective, light disappears. But from the perspective of the universe, nothing is lost. The structure changes, the form changes, the behavior changes, but the energy remains. So the moment light stops is not actually a stopping point at all. It is a transition, a boundary between one form of energy and another. A place where something that was visible becomes something that is not, simply because it no longer behaves in a way your eyes can detect. And this is why the idea of destruction becomes misleading. Because what you are really seeing is not something being erased, but something being transformed so completely that it no longer resembles what it used to be. And once you begin to see it that way, the question starts to shift. Because now it's no longer just about whether light can be destroyed. It becomes about what light turns into. To really understand what's happening when light disappears, you have to step away from the idea of light as a visible thing and focus on something deeper, energy itself. Because light is not just something you see. It is a way energy moves through space, a very specific form, with very specific behavior, but still just one expression of something more fundamental. And energy, as far as we understand, does not go away. It doesn't fade into nothing. It doesn't vanish when you stop looking at it. It doesn't get erased when it changes form. It persists, always. But that persistence doesn't mean it stays recognizable. And this is where most intuition breaks, because you are used to tracking things by how they look. A beam of light is visible. Heat is not. Motion is not. Chemical changes are not. So when light transforms into those things, it feels like something has been lost. The visible part is gone. And without that visual anchor, it feels like the thing itself has disappeared. But what actually disappears is not the energy. It is the form you can perceive. And that difference matters more than it seems. Because the photon, the packet of light, exists only as long as it is moving through space without interacting in a way that ends its identity as a photon. The moment it interacts in a way that transfers its energy completely, it is no longer a photon. It doesn't shrink. It doesn't weaken. It doesn't partially survive. It ceases to exist as that specific structure. But the energy it carried does not follow it into non-existence. It remains, embedded in whatever system absorbed it. And once it is there, it continues to influence the world in ways you don't immediately connect back to light. It might increase the vibration of atoms, raising temperature in a way so subtle you don't notice it. It might push an electron into a different state, storing energy temporarily before releasing it again later. It might contribute to a chain of interactions, spreading through a system, becoming part of something much larger than the original photon that carried it. And once that happens, there is no way to point back and say, that energy is still light. Because it isn't. It has changed identity completely. So what you are dealing with is not destruction. It is transformation so complete that it feels like disappearance. And this leads to a deeper realization. Because if energy never leaves, then light never truly ends in the way you imagine. It does not reach a final point where it stops existing. It reaches a point where it stops being light, where it stops behaving in a way that allows you to recognize it as the thing you started with. And from that moment on, it becomes part of something else, something that may never return to light again, or something that might, under the right conditions, release that energy back into space as a new photon, continuing the cycle. And that cycle has no clear beginning or end. Light is emitted, travels, interacts, transforms, and sometimes is emitted again in a different form. At no point does the underlying energy disappear. It moves through different states, different systems, different behaviors, constantly changing how it expresses itself. So the question, can light be destroyed, begins to reveal its limits, because it assumes that light is something fixed, something that either exists or doesn't. But what you are really looking at is something fluid, something that can become something else without losing what it fundamentally is. And that means the disappearance of light is not a loss. It is a transition you are not used to seeing, a shift from something visible to something that continues on in a completely different form. One of the most common ways light disappears is also one of the least noticed. It becomes heat, not in a dramatic way, not as a visible transformation, but as a quiet shift that happens constantly everywhere around you. Light arrives at a surface, is absorbed by its atoms, and the energy it carried is transferred into motion. The atoms begin to vibrate slightly more than they did before. Their internal energy increases, and that increase is what you call heat. But here's the part that's easy to overlook. There is no moment where the light turns into a tiny glowing particle of heat. There is no visible conversion. The photon arrives, and then it's gone. And in its place, there is simply more motion inside the material, more energy distributed across countless atoms, more microscopic activity that you cannot directly see. And because you cannot see that activity, it feels like the light has vanished. But what has actually happened is far more precise. The energy that was once concentrated in a single photon is now spread out across a system. Instead of existing as one defined packet moving through space, it becomes part of a complex distributed state. It is no longer traveling. It is no longer localized in the same way. It is integrated. And once that happens, there is no simple way to reverse it, because that energy is now mixed into countless interactions. It is shared, exchanged, redistributed at a scale far beyond anything you can track individually. The identity of the original photon is lost, not because its energy is gone, but because it has been absorbed into something much larger. And this is where the idea of destruction starts to break apart completely, because nothing has been erased. The energy is still there, still active, still influencing the world. It has simply lost the structure that made it recognizable as light. And that loss of structure is what feels like disappearance. But if you follow the energy instead of the form, you begin to see something else. You begin to see continuity. The same energy that once traveled across space as light is now part of the temperature of an object. It may later move again, transferred through contact, through radiation, through countless interactions. It may eventually be released again as light under the right conditions. But even if it isn't, it never stops existing. It just keeps changing. And this reveals something deeper about what light actually is. Because light is not a permanent object. It is a temporary expression of energy, a form that exists under specific conditions and then transforms when those conditions change. So when light becomes heat, it hasn't been destroyed. It has completed one phase of its existence. And in doing so, it has become part of something far less visible, but no less real. Something that continues long after the light itself is gone, which means that what you experience as light ending is actually energy continuing in a form you no longer recognize. There is a reason all of this feels like destruction, even when it isn't. It comes from the way your perception is built. You don't experience energy directly. You experience specific forms of energy, light, motion, sound, only when they interact with your senses in a way your brain can interpret. Light becomes visible when it reaches your eyes. Heat becomes noticeable when it changes your skin's temperature enough to register. Most of what energy does, you never perceive at all. And because of that, your sense of reality is tied to appearance. If something stops appearing, it feels like it has stopped existing. This is the illusion, because what disappears is not the thing itself, but your ability to detect it in its current form. Light is a perfect example of this. As long as photons are traveling through space and entering your eyes, you experience them as brightness, color, and shape. But the moment those photons are absorbed by something else, before they ever reach you, they vanish from your perception completely. There is no lingering trace, no visible transition, just absence, and your brain interprets that absence as an ending. But what your brain cannot show you is what replaced it, because the energy that was once visible as light has not stopped. It has simply shifted into forms that do not trigger your visual system. It becomes motion at a microscopic scale, atoms vibrating more intensely. It becomes stored energy inside electrons, temporarily held before being released in another way. It becomes part of thermal energy, spreading through materials in patterns too complex and too subtle for you to track. All of that is happening constantly. and you see none of it. So from your perspective, the light is gone. From the perspective of the system it interacted with, nothing disappeared at all. This mismatch between perception and reality creates a powerful illusion. It makes transformation look like destruction. It makes continuity look like absence. It makes something that is still fully present in the universe feel as though it has been erased. And this illusion becomes even stronger because of how clean the transition appears. When a photon is absorbed, it doesn't fade out gradually. It doesn't weaken over time in a visible way. It simply stops existing as a photon. One moment it is there, moving at the speed of light, carrying energy across space. The next moment, that structure is gone, replaced by a completely different configuration of energy inside a system. There is no intermediate state you can observe, no halfway point, and because of that, it feels like a disappearance. But what actually happened is far more precise than that word suggests. The photon was never a permanent thing. It was a temporary state, an arrangement of energy moving freely through space. And when it encountered the right conditions, that arrangement changed. The energy was transferred, redistributed, integrated into something else. So what ended was not the energy, it was the form. And this is where the idea of destruction begins to dissolve completely. Because destruction implies loss. It implies that something that once existed is no longer part of reality in any form. But in this case, nothing is lost. Everything continues, just not in a way you can follow easily. The energy that was once concentrated in a single photon is now part of a larger system, interacting, spreading, evolving in ways that are no longer simple or visible. It is no longer a clean, trackable entity. It is part of a network of interactions that extends far beyond the original event. And once it becomes part of that network, you lose the ability to point to it and say, that is the same thing. Not because it isn't there, but because it is no longer one thing. It has become many. So the disappearance of light is not a sign that something has ended. It is a sign that something has become too complex to see as a single, identifiable form. And that complexity hides the continuity. It makes something that is still fully present in the universe feel like it has vanished completely. But if you could follow the energy, if you could trace it through every interaction, every transformation, you would never find a point where it stops existing. You would only find points where it changes, again and again, from light to heat to motion to something else entirely, always continuing, never truly gone. And that is what makes the question so deceptive, because it asks whether light can be destroyed, when what actually disappears is only your ability to recognize it. There are moments where the transformation of light goes even deeper than heat, even further from anything you would naturally connect back to a beam traveling through space. Moments where the energy carried by light doesn't just warm a surface or excite an electron for an instant, but becomes part of something structured, something stable, something that can persist long after the original photon is gone. Because light doesn't just interact with matter in simple ways. It can become part of matter. Not in the sense that it turns into a physical object directly, but in the sense that its energy can be stored, rearranged, and woven into systems that hold on to that energy in ways that are no longer obvious. When light is absorbed by certain materials, it can push electrons into higher energy states that last for measurable periods of time. It can trigger chemical reactions, breaking bonds and forming new ones. It can power processes inside living systems, becoming part of the chain of events that allows cells to function, grow, and replicate. And once that happens, the connection to light becomes almost invisible. The photon that started the process is gone. Its identity as light has ended, but the energy it carried is still there, now embedded in a completely different structure. It has become part of something that no longer looks, moves, or behaves like light at all. And this is where the idea of destruction becomes even harder to maintain, because what you are seeing is not something ending. It is something transforming so completely that it enters a different category of existence. A photon arrives, a reaction begins, energy is transferred, and suddenly, what was once light is now part of a chemical structure, or an electrical signal, or a biological process that continues long after the original interaction. And you would never look at that process and say, this is light. But in a very real sense, it is. It is the continuation of that energy in a different form. And this creates a kind of disconnect between cause and recognition, because you can trace the origin of the energy back to light. But once it has transformed, there is no visible link connecting the two. The chain of events becomes too complex, too distributed, too far removed from the original photon for your intuition to follow. So it feels like the light has vanished. But what has actually happened is that the light has become something you no longer identify as light. And that is a very different kind of disappearance. It is not an ending. It is a transition across categories, a shift from something you can see and easily understand into something that operates at a level you don't directly perceive. And once you begin to see it that way, the question changes again. Because now it's not just about whether light can be destroyed. It becomes about how many different forms that same energy can take, how far it can move from its original state, how deeply it can integrate into systems that have nothing outwardly in common with a beam of light. And the answer is, there may be no limit. The energy that once existed as light can become part of almost anything, given the right conditions. It can move through systems, transform again and again, becoming part of processes that are so far removed from the original photon that the connection becomes almost impossible to see. But it never stops being energy. It never leaves the system entirely. It never reaches a point where it simply disappears. So when light seems to end, it may actually be entering a phase where it becomes something far more complex, far more integrated, and far less recognizable than it was before. And that transformation is what you are mistaking for destruction. There is another side to this process that is easy to miss, because while light often seems to disappear into other forms of energy, under the right conditions, it can come back, not as the same photon, not as something that retraces its exact path, but as new light created from the energy that once existed in a different form. And this is where the idea of a cycle begins to appear, a continuous transformation where energy moves through different states, sometimes visible, sometimes not, but never truly gone. Imagine an atom that absorbs a photon. The energy from that photon lifts one of its electrons into a higher energy state. For a brief moment, that energy is stored, held inside the system. But that state is not always stable. Eventually, the electron falls back to a lower energy level, and when it does, the stored energy has to go somewhere. So it is released as a new photon. Light disappears, and then light appears again. But the new photon is not identical to the old one. It may have a different energy, a different wavelength, a different direction. It may emerge later in time after a delay that depends on the system it interacted with. And once it is released, it continues its own journey, completely independent of the original event. And this is happening everywhere, constantly. Light is being absorbed and re-emitted in countless systems, at every scale, in ways you never directly notice. The light that reaches your eyes has often been transformed many times before it arrives. It has interacted, been absorbed, been re-emitted, changed direction, changed energy, become part of a chain of events that stretches far beyond a single source. So what you are seeing is not original light. It is recycled light, energy that has passed through multiple forms before becoming visible again. And this reinforces something important. Because if light can disappear and then reappear in a different form, then what you are observing is not a one-way process. It is not a simple transition from existence to non-existence. It is part of a continuous exchange, where energy flows between systems, sometimes taking the form of light, sometimes taking other forms, and then returning again. And within that exchange, there is no true endpoint, no final moment where the energy stops moving through different states, only transitions. So when you ask whether light can be destroyed, you begin to see that the better question might be whether light ever truly leaves the system at all, because even when it seems to vanish, it may only be waiting in a different form, ready to become light again under the right conditions. And that changes the meaning of disappearance. Because now, instead of something ending, you're looking at something that moves through phases, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always part of the same underlying process. A process where energy is never lost, only transformed, and sometimes, quietly, returned to light once more. Up to this point, everything has been pointing in the same direction, almost too consistently to ignore. Light appears, travels, interacts, and then disappears from view. But every time you follow that disappearance closely, you find that nothing has actually been lost. The photon is gone, yes, but the energy it carried is still there, redistributed into motion, heat, electrical activity, or stored states inside matter. Over and over again, what looked like destruction turned out to be transformation. And because of that, it starts to feel like the question itself might have been flawed from the beginning. Maybe light cannot be destroyed at all. Maybe it only ever changes form. But there is a point where that idea is tested, a boundary where the transformation becomes so extreme, so complete, that it no longer feels like a simple conversion from one visible form to another. A place where light does something that feels much closer to an ending. Not because the energy disappears, but because the identity of light is lost so completely that nothing about it remains recognizable. This happens at very high energies. Under the right conditions, a photon can carry enough energy to do more than excite electrons or heat a material. It can interact in such a way that its energy is converted into matter itself, not metaphorically, not indirectly, but literally. The energy that once existed as a photon can become the mass of particles. For example, an energetic photon can transform into an electron and its counterpart, a positron. Two particles with mass, charge, and entirely different behavior from the light that created them. And at that moment, something very specific happens. The light is gone, not hidden inside the particles, as a tiny piece of itself, not waiting to reemerge as the same photon. The structure that defined it as light, something massless, traveling at the speed of light, behaving as a quantum of electromagnetic energy, no longer exists. In its place, there are particles with mass, particles that move differently, interact differently, exist in a completely different category of behavior. If you were to look at that system afterward, you would not say, there is light here. You would say, there are particles. And this is where the idea of destruction begins to feel more convincing than ever. Because the thing you started with is no longer present in any recognizable way. It has not just changed slightly, it has crossed a boundary, from light to matter. And that boundary feels final. It feels like a true ending of what light was. But even here, something deeper is still holding everything together. Because although the identity of light is gone, the energy is not. The total energy that existed before the transformation is still present in the system, now expressed as mass, motion, and interaction between particles. The universe has not lost anything. It has only rearranged it. And more importantly, that rearrangement is not permanent, because under the right conditions, the reverse process can happen. Particles can interact, annihilate, and release their energy back into space as photons once again. Matter can become light, just as light became matter. The direction of the transformation can flip, depending on how the system evolves. So even in the most extreme case, where light seems to disappear completely into something else, there is still a path back. Not for the same photon, not as a reversal of time, but as a continuation of the same energy, moving through different forms. And this is where the idea of ending begins to dissolve once more, because what looked like a final boundary turns out to be part of a larger cycle, a system where energy flows between forms, light to matter, matter to light, without ever reaching a point of true disappearance. The forms change, the identities change, the behaviors change, but the underlying quantity, the thing that makes all of it possible, remains constant. So even here, at what feels like the most extreme transformation imaginable, you do not find destruction. You find continuity, hidden beneath a change so complete that it feels like an ending. And that forces one last shift in how you think about light. Because if light can become matter, and matter can become light again, then light is not a fixed thing moving through the universe. It is a phase, a temporary expression of something deeper, a moment in a chain of transformations that never truly stops. So when you ask whether light can be destroyed, you're really asking whether that chain can ever be broken. And everything you've seen suggests the same answer. Not because light is indestructible in the way an object would be, but because what light is made of never leaves the system at all. If you follow this idea all the way through, something larger begins to emerge, something that goes beyond light itself and touches the structure of the universe as a whole. Because what you've been seeing is not just a property of photons. It is a pattern, a rule that seems to apply everywhere. Nothing truly disappears, not in the way you instinctively imagine. What changes is the form. What changes is the structure, the behavior, the way something expresses itself. But underneath all of that, there is a kind of continuity that never breaks, a conservation that runs through everything, quietly holding the system together, even as everything within it transforms. And this becomes easier to see when you stop focusing on individual events and start looking at the bigger picture. Light is emitted from a source. It travels, it interacts, it is absorbed, it becomes heat, motion, stored energy, chemical change, or even matter. That energy spreads, moves, transforms again, passes through systems, becomes part of processes you never directly observe. And sometimes, under the right conditions, it returns to light, continuing the cycle. At no point in that chain does anything leave the system. At no point does something simply vanish without a trace. There is always a continuation. But that continuation becomes harder and harder to follow, because as energy spreads out, as it becomes part of more complex systems, it loses the simplicity that made it easy to track. A single photon is easy to imagine. A beam of light is easy to visualize. But once that energy is distributed across billions of atoms, once it becomes part of a thermal system or a chemical network, it becomes effectively invisible to your intuition. Not gone, just too complex, too diffused, too far removed from its original form to recognize. And this is where the illusion of destruction becomes strongest, because what you are really experiencing is a loss of clarity, a loss of the simple, identifiable structure that allowed you to say, "This is light." Once that structure dissolves into something more complex, your mind no longer tracks it as the same thing. It feels like it has ended, even though it has simply changed into something you don't follow as easily. And this reveals something fundamental about how you understand reality. You don't track continuity at the level of energy. You track it at the level of form. When the form changes too much, you lose the sense that it is the same thing continuing. And that is exactly what happens with light. So when you ask whether light can be destroyed, you are really asking whether its form can disappear. And the answer to that is clearly yes. But if you ask whether what makes light possible, its energy, can be removed from the universe entirely, everything you've seen points to a different answer. No, because the universe does not seem to allow that kind of loss. It allows transformation. It allows complexity. It allows forms to appear and disappear, to change so completely that they become unrecognizable. But underneath all of that, there is a continuity that remains untouched. And that continuity is what you are really observing when light seems to vanish. You are not witnessing destruction. You are witnessing the moment where something simple becomes something too complex to follow. And in that complexity, it continues. At the beginning, the idea felt straightforward. Light appears, light travels, light disappears. It felt like a sequence with a clear ending, a point where something that once existed simply stops. And because that matches how you experience so many things, objects breaking, sounds fading, motion stopping, it felt natural to apply that same logic to light. But everything you've uncovered has slowly taken that simplicity away, because what looked like an ending never actually was. Light does not fade into nothing. It does not reach a final point where it ceases to exist without a trace. What ends is the form you recognize, the photon, the beam, the visible structure that your perception can detect. But beneath that form, something continues without interruption. Energy moves on, it shifts, it transforms, it becomes something else. And in doing so, it leaves behind the identity of light, not because that identity was destroyed, but because it was never meant to be permanent in the first place. And this is where the deepest shift happens, because you begin to realize that light is not a thing in the way you imagined. It is not a fixed object moving through space until it is destroyed. It is a phase, a temporary expression of energy under specific conditions. When those conditions exist, energy appears as light. When they change, energy becomes something else. And once you see that, the question itself transforms. Can light be destroyed? Becomes less about light, and more about whether anything can truly end at all. Because if light, one of the most fundamental things you can observe, never truly disappears but only changes form, then destruction, as you imagine it, may not exist at this level of reality. There are only transitions, endings of form, beginnings of new behavior, and an underlying continuity that never breaks. So the moment light seems to end is not a disappearance, it is a crossing from one way of existing into another. And once you see it that way, something becomes clear. Light does not die, it changes, and it continues in a form you no longer recognize. There is a kind of light you never think about, not because it is rare or insignificant, but because it never becomes part of your experience. Every second, in every direction around you, photons are being emitted, traveling through space, interacting with matter, and disappearing again without ever reaching your eyes. They strike surfaces you are not looking at. They get absorbed inside objects. They scatter, transform, become heat, become motion, become something else entirely. And from your point of view, none of it ever happened. And that is not a small detail, because it means that your experience of light is incredibly selective. You do not see all light. You see the small fraction that survives the journey in exactly the right way, at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right conditions to enter your eyes and trigger a response your brain can interpret. Everything else, vast amounts of energy, moving through space and constantly transforming, remains outside your awareness. So when you think about light disappearing, you are already dealing with a filtered version of reality, a version where only certain outcomes are visible, and everything else is silently transformed into something you don't track. This creates a powerful distortion, because when something leaves your perception, it feels like it has left reality itself. If you don't see it, if you can't detect it, if there is no direct evidence in your experience, your mind treats it as gone. But in truth, all that has happened is that the energy has moved into a form or direction that no longer connects to your senses. The light didn't stop existing. It stopped being visible to you. And that difference is easy to ignore, but it changes everything, because it means that disappearance is not a reliable indicator of what is actually happening. It is a reflection of your limits, not of the system itself. The universe does not organize itself around what you can perceive. It continues its processes, regardless of whether you can follow them or not. So even at this level, something important becomes clear. Light is constantly appearing and disappearing from your point of view, but those appearances and disappearances are not fundamental events. They are just moments where energy happens to cross into or out of the narrow range of interactions your senses can detect. And once you begin to see that, the question starts to shift again. Because now it's not just about whether light can be destroyed. It's about how much of reality is unfolding beyond what you can ever directly observe, and how often something seems to end, only because you stopped being able to see it. There is another way light can seem to disappear, and this one is even more subtle because nothing dramatic happens at all. There is no sudden absorption, no clear interaction where the photon transfers its energy into something else. Instead, the light simply continues, and in doing so becomes less and less noticeable until, from your perspective, it might as well not exist. Imagine light moving through space, traveling further and further away from its source. Each photon still carries its energy. Nothing about it weakens in the way you might expect from everyday experience. It does not fade as a particle. It does not lose pieces of itself along the way. But as it spreads across a larger and larger region, its effect becomes harder to detect. The same amount of energy is now distributed across more space, more directions, more possibilities, and eventually it becomes indistinguishable, not gone, but lost in the background of everything else. This is a different kind of disappearance, because here, the light has not been transformed into heat or motion or matter. It is still light, still photons, still traveling, still carrying energy, but it has reached a point where you can no longer isolate it, no longer separate it from the noise of the universe. And from your perspective, that feels exactly the same as destruction. Because if something can no longer be detected, no longer measured, no longer confirmed as a distinct event, it effectively stops existing in any practical sense. You cannot interact with it. You cannot observe it. You cannot even prove it is there without extraordinary effort. But that does not mean it has ceased to exist. It means it has spread too far to matter in a localized way. And this introduces a second illusion, one that is quieter but just as powerful as the first. Not the illusion of destruction through transformation, but the illusion of disappearance through dilution, because something does not have to be destroyed to become invisible. It only has to become too spread out, too diffuse, too integrated into the background for you to recognize it as a separate thing. And this is happening constantly, especially at cosmic scales. Light from distant stars travels across unimaginable distances. Some of it reaches you, carrying information about its source, but most of it spreads out into space, becoming part of a vast, faint background that you will never notice directly. It is still there, still moving, still interacting at some level, but no longer in a form that stands out. So it feels like it has disappeared. But once again, nothing has been lost. The energy is still part of the system, still present, still continuing. And this shows that there are multiple ways something can end from your point of view. It can transform into something else entirely. Or it can remain what it is, but spread so far that it effectively vanishes from your awareness. And in both cases, the result feels the same. An absence, a silence, a disappearance. But in neither case is anything truly gone. It has only moved beyond the limits of what you can track. And that makes the question even more subtle, because now you are not just asking whether light can be destroyed. You are asking how many ways something can stop being visible without ever stopping its existence. At some point, if you follow every one of these paths, absorption, transformation, spreading, re-emission, they all begin to point toward the same conclusion. Not a small conclusion about light specifically, but something much broader about how the universe behaves as a whole. The universe does not seem to lose things, not in the fundamental sense. What it does is change them, relentlessly, continuously, without pause. Light leaves a source and moves through space as a clean, simple structure. A photon, a packet of energy with a clear identity. That identity is easy to recognize, easy to track, easy to understand. It feels like a thing, but the moment it interacts, that simplicity begins to dissolve. The energy spreads into atoms, into electrons, into motion, into heat, into complex systems that no longer carry a single, unified identity. And once that happens, your ability to follow it collapses. Not because the energy is gone, but because it is no longer one thing. It becomes many. It becomes distributed across countless interactions, each one passing a fraction of that energy forward, changing it slightly, blending it into something larger. The original photon is not hiding somewhere inside that system. It is not preserved as a recognizable unit. It has been completely integrated into a network of processes that extend far beyond the moment where it first disappeared. And this is where the idea of destruction starts to lose its meaning entirely, because destruction implies removal. It implies that something that once existed is no longer part of the system at all. But when you look closely, that never actually happens. What happens instead is dispersion, transformation, integration. The energy is not removed. It is redistributed so thoroughly that it no longer exists as a single, identifiable piece. And that redistribution is what creates the illusion of loss, because your mind is not built to track distributed systems. It is built to track objects, defined things, clear identities. When something becomes too complex, too spread out, too entangled with everything else, you stop recognizing it as the same thing. It feels like it has ended, even though it is still fully present, just in a form you can no longer isolate. And this is not a limitation of physics. It is a limitation of perception. The universe does not operate in terms of things the way you naturally think about them. It operates in terms of interactions, exchanges, transformations. What you call a thing, a photon, a particle, an object, is just a temporary pattern that remains stable long enough for you to recognize it. Once that pattern dissolves, the underlying reality continues without interruption. So when light disappears, what you are really witnessing is not the removal of something from existence, but the end of a pattern that was simple enough to see, simple enough to name, simple enough to follow. And when that pattern breaks apart into something more complex, your mind interprets that as an ending. But from the perspective of the system, nothing has ended at all. The energy is still there, still moving, still interacting, still shaping what happens next. Just no longer as a single, clean structure you can point to and call light. And once you begin to see it that way, the question shifts again. Because now you are no longer asking whether light can be destroyed. You are asking whether anything can ever truly leave the system. And everything you've seen suggests the same answer. No, because the system keeps everything, even if it changes beyond recognition, even if it spreads beyond detection, even if it becomes part of processes so complex that you can never trace them back to their origin. It remains. And that means that what you experience as disappearance is not an end. It is a loss of simplicity, a transition from something you can understand easily to something you can no longer follow at all. There is one thing that does end, and it's the part that keeps confusing everything: the form. Not the energy, not the underlying reality, but the structure that made something recognizable as light. Because when you say light, you're not talking about energy in general. You're talking about a very specific configuration, a photon, a packet of electromagnetic energy moving through space in a way your eyes can detect. A clean, simple structure with a clear identity. And that structure is temporary. It exists under certain conditions, and the moment those conditions change, the structure disappears. Completely. Not partially. Not gradually. It ends. And that's the part your intuition locks onto. Because from your point of view, that structure is the thing. The photon is the light. So when the photon stops existing, it feels like the light has been destroyed. But what actually ended was the pattern. And this is where everything becomes clearer. Because once you separate the idea of energy from the idea of form, the confusion starts to dissolve. Energy continues, always. But forms, patterns, structures, identities, those are temporary. They appear when conditions allow them, and they disappear when those conditions change. A photon is one of those patterns, a very stable one while it travels through empty space. But the moment it interacts in a way that transfers its energy completely, that pattern cannot continue. The conditions that define it no longer exist. So the photon does not weaken or shrink. It ends instantly. And that is a real ending. But it is not destruction. Because what ended was not the energy itself. It was the arrangement, the structure that made that energy behave like light. And once that structure is gone, the energy continues in a different form, no longer following the rules that define light. So what you are really seeing every time light disappears is the end of a pattern, a transition from one structure to another, from something simple and visible to something complex and hidden. And that transition is so complete, so immediate, that it feels like something has been erased. But nothing has been erased, only rearranged. And once you understand that, the question becomes sharper. Because now it's not about whether light can be destroyed. It's about whether patterns can end. And the answer to that is clearly yes. They end all the time, but the energy underneath them never does. There is a deeper shift hiding inside all of this. And it has nothing to do with light specifically, but with the way you think about things in general. You tend to treat identity as something stable. A thing is what it is. Light is light. A photon is a photon. It exists, it moves, and then it either continues or stops. That's the framework your mind prefers. Clear categories, fixed labels, stable identities you can follow from beginning to end. But what you've seen quietly breaks that framework. Because light is not a permanent identity. It is a temporary role that energy plays under very specific conditions. When energy is moving freely through space in a certain way, you call it light. When that same energy is absorbed and becomes part of atomic motion, you call it heat. When it is stored in an electron, you call it excitation. When it becomes part of a particle's mass, you call it matter. Different names, different behaviors, same underlying thing. And that means the identity of light is not fixed. It is conditional. It exists only as long as the conditions that define it are present. The moment those conditions change, the identity ends. Not the energy, not the underlying reality, just the label. And this is why the idea of destruction feels so convincing, because you are tracking the identity, not the continuity. When the identity disappears, it feels like the thing itself has disappeared. But in reality, what you were tracking was only one phase of a much larger process. And that process doesn't stop. It doesn't reach a final point where everything ends. It just keeps shifting from one form to another. So when you ask whether light can be destroyed, you are really asking whether that identity can end. And the answer is yes, all the time. But that is not the same as asking whether what light is made of can disappear, because that part never leaves. It only changes the role it is playing. And once you see that, something becomes clear. Light is not a thing moving through the universe. It is a moment, a phase, a temporary expression of energy that appears under the right conditions and disappears when those conditions are no longer there. And that disappearance is what you've been calling destruction, even though it was never that at all. At the beginning, the question felt simple. Can light be destroyed? It sounded like something that should have a clear answer, yes or no. Either light can end or it cannot. Either something is lost or it isn't. The question assumes that light is a stable thing, something that exists in a fixed way, and can therefore be removed from existence in the same way an object can be broken or erased. But everything you've seen has slowly taken that assumption apart, not by replacing it with a better, simple answer, but by showing that the question itself is built on the wrong idea. Because light does not behave like a fixed thing. It behaves like a condition, a specific arrangement of energy that only exists under certain circumstances. And the moment those circumstances change, that arrangement disappears completely. Not gradually, not partially, but instantly. And that is where the confusion begins, because from your perspective, that instant feels like destruction. The photon was there, moving through space, carrying energy in a form you could recognize. Then it interacts, and suddenly it is gone. There is no visible trace, no lingering version of it continuing forward. So your mind fills in the gap with the simplest explanation available. It must have been destroyed. But what you are actually seeing is not destruction. It is replacement. The energy that once existed as light has become something else so completely that there is no overlap between the two states. There is no intermediate form your senses can follow, no gradual transition you can observe. One moment the energy behaves as light, the next moment it behaves as heat, motion, or stored energy inside matter. The change is total, and because it is total, it feels like an ending. But nothing has been removed from the system. The energy is still there, still active, still shaping what happens next. So the question begins to shift, not because it has been answered, but because it has been reframed. It is no longer about whether light can be destroyed as a thing. It becomes about whether the state we call light can stop existing in a given moment. And the answer to that is clearly yes, but that is not the same as destruction. That is transformation so complete that it feels like disappearance. And once you see that clearly, the question loses its original meaning. Because light is not something that can be destroyed in the way you imagined. It is something that can only stop being light. From your perspective, light ends all the time, and it ends in a way that feels absolute. A beam crosses a room, reaches a surface, and is simply gone. A reflection disappears the moment the angle changes. A bright source vanishes when you turn away. There is no visible continuation, no trace left behind that tells you where that light went or what it became. One moment it is there, shaping everything you see, and the next moment it has completely left your experience. And because your perception is built around presence, not transformation, that feels like a true ending. You see light only when photons reach your eyes. That is the only condition under which light becomes part of your reality. The moment that condition is no longer met, when the photons are absorbed, redirected, or simply never reach you, the light disappears completely from your world. There is no built-in sense of what replaced it. Your mind does not show you the heat it became, or the motion it triggered, or the chain of interactions it entered. It simply removes the light from your experience, and that removal feels like loss. But what you are actually experiencing is a limit, a boundary between what you can detect and what you cannot. Because the moment light leaves your perception, it has not left reality. It has only crossed into a form that your senses do not register. The energy continues, moving through systems, spreading, transforming, becoming part of processes that remain invisible to you. And this is why the illusion is so convincing, because your experience gives you a clean break, a before and an after, a moment where something was present and then suddenly wasn't. There is no visible bridge connecting the two states, so your mind interprets that gap as an ending. But that gap is not in reality. It is in your perception. In reality, the transition is continuous. The energy flows from one form into another, without interruption. There is no point where it stops existing, only a point where it stops appearing in a way you can see. And once you recognize that, the idea of destruction begins to lose its foundation. Because what you are calling an ending is actually a shift in visibility, a change in how energy presents itself to you. So the light that seems to end is not being removed from existence. It is simply leaving the narrow window where your senses can follow it. And beyond that window, it continues. At this point, the question has changed so much that it almost no longer resembles what you started with. Can light be destroyed? At first, it sounded like a simple yes or no problem, a question about whether something can exist or not exist. But now, after everything you've followed, absorption, transformation, spreading, conversion into matter, it becomes clear that the question was never really about light itself. It was about endings, about whether anything can truly reach a point where it is no longer part of reality in any form. And light has quietly shown you that the answer is not what you expected. Because every time light seems to end, something continues. When it is absorbed, the energy becomes motion, heat, or stored energy inside matter. When it spreads out, it becomes too diffuse to detect, but it still exists. When it converts into matter, it takes on an entirely new identity, but the energy remains. In every case, the visible form disappears, but the underlying reality does not. And that means the ending you experience is not a fundamental event. It is a surface level change, a shift from something simple and visible to something complex and hidden. And that shift is so complete that it feels like a loss, even though nothing has actually been removed from the system. So the answer you arrive at is not a clean statement. It's a realization. Light can end as light, but it cannot be destroyed in the way you imagined. Because what makes light possible, the energy it carries, never leaves. It only changes form. And once you see that clearly, the idea of destruction begins to dissolve into something else entirely. Not an ending, but a transition you are not used to noticing. There is one last layer to this that makes the idea of destruction feel so convincing, and it has nothing to do with physics itself, but with how your mind interprets events. You are used to things ending. Objects break, sounds fade, motion stops, and when they do, they do not come back in the same form. That pattern is so deeply embedded in your experience that you automatically extend it to everything, including light. When something disappears cleanly and completely from your perception, it feels like it has reached a final state, a point beyond which nothing continues. But what you have been uncovering shows that this sense of finality is not built into reality in the way you think. It is built into your interpretation of it, because every example you've followed, light being absorbed, spread out, converted into matter, or transformed into heat, has revealed the same structure. The form ends, but the underlying energy does not. The pattern disappears, but the system continues. And the reason it feels final is because the transition is so complete that your mind cannot connect what comes after to what came before. This is what creates the illusion of an absolute ending. When the identity of something changes beyond recognition, your brain stops tracking it as the same thing. It no longer feels like a continuation. It feels like a replacement, or worse, like a disappearance. But that feeling is not evidence of destruction. It is evidence of a limitation in how you follow continuity. You can track something as long as it remains simple, as long as it keeps a clear identity. But the moment it becomes complex, distributed, or fundamentally different in behavior, that continuity becomes invisible to you. And this is exactly what happens with light. As long as it exists as a photon, it is easy to understand. It moves, it arrives, it interacts. But once it becomes part of a larger system, heat spreading through atoms, energy stored in electrons, matter formed from high-energy interactions, it loses that simplicity. It becomes part of something too complex to follow as a single thread. And when that happens, your mind interprets that loss of simplicity as an ending. But in reality, nothing has ended. The energy is still there, still active, still influencing what happens next. It has simply moved into a state where your intuition can no longer track it as the same thing. And because of that, it feels like it has reached a final point, even though it is still fully part of the system. So the idea of destruction, in this context, is not a property of the universe. It is a property of perception, a way of interpreting transitions that are too complete to follow. And once you see that, something changes in how you understand the question you started with, because you are no longer asking whether light can be destroyed. You are asking whether anything can truly reach a point of no continuation at all. And everything you've seen suggests that the answer is not found in the disappearance of forms, but in the persistence of what lies beneath them. At the beginning, the question felt simple. Can light be destroyed? It sounded like something that should have a clear, final answer, a boundary you could point to, a moment where something that once existed simply stops being part of reality. That idea feels natural because it matches how your experience presents the world to you. Things appear, they exist, and then they end. And when they end cleanly enough, without anything obvious replacing them, it feels like they are gone. But everything you have followed has slowly dismantled that idea, not by replacing it with a more complex answer, but by revealing that the concept of ending itself is not what it seemed to be. Because every time light appears to disappear, something continues. Not in the same form, not in a way you can easily recognize, but in a way that never breaks the continuity of the system. The photon ends. The light ends. The visible structure disappears completely. But the energy does not. And that is the part that changes everything, because it means that what you have been calling destruction is not the removal of something from existence, but the loss of a specific pattern. A pattern that was simple enough to see, simple enough to name, simple enough to follow. And when that pattern dissolves into something more complex, your mind interprets that as an ending, even though it is actually a transition from something visible to something hidden, a transition from something you can track to something that continues beyond your ability to follow it. And that is why the disappearance of light feels so absolute, because the change is total. There is no overlap between the before and the after, no bridge your senses can detect, just a clean break in your perception. But that break does not exist in reality. In reality, the process is continuous. The energy flows from one form into another, without interruption, without loss, without reaching a final point where it simply stops being part of the system. So the answer you arrive at is not a simple yes or no. Light can end as light. It can stop existing as a photon. It can disappear completely from your perception, but it cannot be destroyed in the way you imagined, because what makes light possible never leaves. It only changes, and that leads to a deeper realization, one that extends far beyond light itself. Because if something as fundamental as light does not truly disappear, but only transforms, then the idea of absolute destruction may not exist at all at this level of reality. There are only forms that appear and disappear, structures that begin and end, identities that come and go. But underneath all of that, there is continuity, a system that keeps everything, even when it changes beyond recognition. And once you see that, the question you started with no longer feels like a mystery. It feels like a doorway, because it leads you to something deeper than light. It leads you to the realization that nothing truly disappears. Only the way it exists changes. If this made you rethink something as simple as light, then you're starting to see what this channel is really about. Not just understanding physics, but slowly uncovering how reality behaves beneath the surface of what feels obvious. If you enjoy these calm, deep explorations, subscribe to Science Sleep Theory. And before you go, leave a comment. Do you think anything in the universe can truly be destroyed? Or does everything only change form? Take a moment, and I'll see you in the next one.